The morning sun cast long shadows across Chicago O'Hare International Airport's Terminal 3 as passengers shuffled through security checkpoints, their wheeled luggage creating a symphony of clicks and rolls against the polished floor. Among them was a young business consultant, her navy blazer perfectly pressed, and her laptop bag slung professionally across her shoulder. As she made her way to Gate K7, she couldn't shake the feeling that this Monday morning flight would be different from her usual business trips. Flight 2317 to San Francisco was boarding right on schedule. The consultant had done this route dozens of times before, so many times that she could predict exactly when the gate agent would call each boarding group. She even memorized which coffee shop served the best espresso, the one near Gate K4, and which bathroom was usually the cleanest, the one by K9. As she settled into her window seat in row 15, she pulled out her tablet, ready to review presentations for her upcoming client meeting. The familiar announcements began to play overhead. Welcome aboard. Please stow your carry-on items. Flight time today will be approximately 5 hours and 20 minutes. Everything felt routine, predictable, almost boring in its normalcy. The morning light streamed through the small oval window, warming her arm as she observed her fellow passengers boarding. There was the usual mix: tired-looking business travelers in wrinkled suits, a young couple clearly headed for a San Francisco vacation, and a group of tech workers identifiable either company hoodies and animated discussions about coding frameworks. A flight attendant with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair moved through the cabin, helping passengers with their bags and checking seatbelts. Her experienced hands moved efficiently, her voice carrying that perfect blend of authority and warmth that comes from years of experience in the skies. The consultant couldn't help but notice a well-dressed passenger in first class who boarded last, moving with an air of practiced confidence. There was something about the way this passenger scanned the cabin, quick, calculated glances that seemed more purposeful than the usual lost-looking wandering of most travelers. As the aircraft doors closed with their characteristic thunk, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing clear skies all the way to California. The consultant pulled out her noise-canceling headphones, ready to dive into work mode. She had no idea that in just a few hours, this routine flight would become the talk of national news. The Boeing 737 taxied smoothly onto the runway, its engines humming to life with increasing intensity. As they accelerated for takeoff, the consultant gazed out at the Chicago skyline, its buildings growing smaller until they disappeared into a layer of wispy clouds. The seatbelt sign dinged off at 10,000 feet, and the cabin crew began their drink service preparations. A baby started crying somewhere in the back, quickly hushed by a parent's gentle murmuring. The businessman across the aisle had already fallen asleep, his head tilted at an awkward angle that would surely result in a stiff neck later. The tech workers had their laptops open, their faces illuminated by the blue glow of their screens. Everything seemed perfectly normal, predictable, safe. But sometimes the most extraordinary events unfold on the most ordinary days. And Flight 2317 was about to become anything but ordinary. Little did any of the passengers know that their routine Monday morning flight was carrying more than just travelers and their luggage. Among them sat someone whose presence would turn this journey into one of the most talked about flights of the year. The next few hours would prove that at 35,000 feet, nothing is ever quite as simple as it seems. The flight had settled into that peaceful lull that usually comes after the first drink service. The soft hum of the engines had become white noise, lulling some passengers into light naps while others watched movies on their screens or typed away on laptops. It was during this quiet moment, about 3 hours into the flight, that the first signs of trouble began to surface. It started with a raised voice from the back of the plane, row 23, to be exact. A middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair and reading glasses was speaking to a flight attendant, his voice carrying an edge that made nearby passengers look up from their books and devices. At first, it seemed like a typical complaint about legroom or maybe a drink order gone wrong. "This is completely unacceptable," the man was saying, his voice growing louder with each word. "I need to speak to someone in charge right now." The flight attendant, maintaining her professional composure, tried to calm him down with practiced phrases and a gentle tone. But something was different about this situation. The man's agitation seemed to grow despite her best efforts. Passengers throughout the cabin began shifting in their seats, that uncomfortable tension spreading like a wave. The young consultant from row 15 lowered her headphones, her presentation forgotten. Two teenagers a few rows ahead pulled out their phones, ready to record what they assumed would be another viral airplane freak-out video. The man stood up, despite repeated requests to remain seated. He wasn't shouting, but his voice carried authority that seemed out of place for an angry passenger. "I insist on speaking with the captain," he declared, his stance firm but controlled. Something about his demeanor didn't quite match the typical profile of an unruly passenger. His movements were too measured, his eyes too alert. A flight attendant with gray-streaked hair made her way down the aisle with a drink cart, creating a subtle barrier between the standing man and the rest of the cabin. Other crew members appeared from different directions, their movements casual but purposeful. The choreography of their response suggested they were following some kind of protocol that went beyond standard customer service. The tension in the cabin was palpable now. A mother pulled her young son closer, whispering reassuring words into his ear. A retired couple exchanged worried glances, their hands finding each other's in a gesture of comfort. The tech workers had stopped their coding discussion, their screens forgotten, as they watched the scene unfold. What happened next caught everyone off guard. Two men who had been sitting quietly, one in an aisle seat near the front, another in the middle section, stood up almost simultaneously. They moved with the kind of confident precision that spoke of professional training. The passengers closest to them noticed something else. Beneath their casual clothing, they carried themselves with unmistakable authority. The well-dressed passenger in first class, who had boarded last in Chicago, was now fully awake and watching the scene with intense interest. Her hand moved slowly toward her handbag, a motion that didn't go unnoticed by the standing men. The atmosphere in the cabin had transformed completely. What had started as an apparent case of air rage was evolving into something else entirely. The other passengers could sense it. This wasn't a typical mile-high dispute about reclining seats or overhead bin space. The air felt charged with unspoken tension, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. Phones continued to record, their owners probably thinking they were documenting just another flight gone wrong. But those watching closely could tell this was different. The way the crew communicated through subtle glances, the precise movements of the standing men, the calculating look in the eyes of the first-class passenger, it all pointed to something much more significant than a simple passenger complaint. As the situation continued to unfold at 35,000 feet, one thing became clear to everyone on board. Flight 2317 was about to become much more than just another story about bad behavior in the skies. The real question was, what exactly were they all witnessing? The tension in the cabin reached its peak as the two men who had risen from their seats stepped forward, their movements calm but purposeful. "Federal Air Marshal," one of them announced quietly, showing his badge in a way that only the nearby passengers could see. The revelation sent a ripple of whispers through the cabin. Passengers leaned toward each other to share what they'd heard. The agitated man in row 23 didn't seem surprised by their presence. Instead, something unexpected happened. His demeanor shifted entirely. His shoulders relaxed, and a slight smile crossed his face as he reached slowly into his jacket pocket. The air marshals tensed, but their training told them something wasn't quite right about this situation. "Detective, Organized Crime Division," the man said softly, producing his own badge with practiced ease. The shield caught the sunlight streaming through a nearby window, its golden surface gleaming. The air marshals examined his credentials, their expressions changing from concern to professional recognition. The other passengers watched in fascination as what had appeared to be a confrontation transformed into a quiet, intense conversation between law enforcement professionals. The flight attendants maintained their positions, creating a subtle barrier that kept other passengers from getting too close to the discussion. In row 15, the business consultant noticed something odd. The well-dressed passenger in first class, who had been so alert moments ago, was now trying very hard to appear disinterested. Her magazine was held at an angle that didn't quite match her sightline, and her hand remained suspiciously close to her handbag. The detective and the air marshals moved their discussion to the galley area, their voices too low for anyone else to hear. Passengers who had been recording the events slowly lowered their phones, realizing this wasn't going to be the kind of viral video they'd expected. Instead, they were witnessing something far more intriguing. A young boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Mom, is this like one of those spy movies?" he whispered, loud enough for several nearby passengers to hear. His mother shushed him gently, but his innocent question captured what everyone was thinking. This was beginning to feel like something straight out of a thriller movie, except it was happening right here on their routine Monday morning flight. The head flight attendant, the one with the silver-streaked hair, made her way through the cabin with a practiced smile, offering water to passengers and quietly asking people to return to their seats. But her eyes kept darting between the law enforcement huddle and the first-class cabin, her movements carefully choreographed to keep her within sight of both. As the detective returned to his seat, passengers noticed he chose a different row, one with a clear view of the first-class section. The air marshals also repositioned themselves, their new seats creating what experienced travelers might recognize as a tactical formation throughout the cabin. The atmosphere on the flight had completely transformed. Gone was the usual mid-flight boredom, replaced by an electric anticipation. Passengers found themselves paying attention to details that they would normally ignore: the subtle hand signals between flight attendants, the occasional glances exchanged between the law enforcement officers, the way certain passengers seemed to be under careful observation. The tech workers who had been coding earlier now had their laptops closed, engrossed in what was unfolding. The retired couple held hands tighter, sharing looks that spoke of both concern and excitement. Even the businessman who had been sleeping was now wide awake, his earlier neck twist forgotten, as he tried to make sense of the situation. Through the windows, the landscape below continued to pass by, mountains and clouds indifferent to the drama, unfolding miles above them. The plane maintained its course towards San Francisco, but everyone aboard knew this flight had veered into extraordinary territory. As the detective settled into his new seat, his relaxed posture suggested that the real operation was just beginning. What none of the regular passengers realized yet was that they weren't just witnesses to a random incident. They were part of a carefully orchestrated operation, one that had been in planning for months. And in the next few hours, they would see exactly why this particular flight had been chosen for what was about to unfold. The next phase of events unfolded with the subtlety of a chess match. The well-dressed woman in first class had maintained her composed facade, but small details began to betray her growing unease. Her perfectly manicured fingers drummed against the armrest in an irregular pattern. Every few minutes, she would check her watch, though she tried to make the gesture appear casual. The detective, now seated where he could observe the first-class cabin, pulled out what looked like a crossword puzzle book. But the business consultant, who had a clear view from her seat, noticed he never actually wrote anything down. His attention was focused elsewhere, his pen merely a prop in an elaborate performance. A flight attendant approached the woman in first class, offering a beverage service. "Would you like anything to drink?" she asked, her voice carrying the usual professional courtesy. The woman declined with a polite smile, but those watching closely noticed how her hand tightened around her handbag, a designer piece that seemed to never leave her grip. The air marshals had settled into their new positions, appearing to doze but remaining alert. One pretended to watch a movie, his screen visible to other passengers, but his earphones weren't actually connected. The other seemed absorbed in a magazine, though he hadn't turned a page in the last 20 minutes. Somewhere over the Rocky Mountains, the captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing some light turbulence ahead. As the seatbelt sign dinged on, passengers noticed the timing seemed oddly convenient. It gave the crew a legitimate reason to ensure everyone stayed in their seats. The young boy who had mentioned spy movies earlier whispered to his mother again, this time pointing out how the first-class passenger kept looking around. "She's nervous, Mom," he said, showing the kind of innocent observation that often cuts straight to the truth. His mother smiled nervously, trying to distract him with a game on her tablet. In the center of the plane, the retired couple exchanged knowing looks. The husband, who had mentioned earlier to his seatmate that he was a former military officer, clearly recognized the choreographed movements of trained professionals. His wife squeezed his hand, understanding without words that they were witnessing something significant. The woman in first class made a move to stand up, presumably to visit the restroom. Almost immediately, one of the air marshals shifted in his seat, while the flight attendant with silver-streaked hair appeared in the aisle, pushing her cart forward. The timing was too perfect to be coincidental. The woman sat back down, her composed expression flickering for just a moment. Through the cabin windows, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the wing, creating patterns that danced with the slight turbulence. The tech workers, still fascinated by the unfolding events, had started a quiet discussion about similar cases they'd read about online. Their whispered conversation caught the attention of nearby passengers, adding pieces to the puzzle everyone was trying to solve. The business consultant noticed something else. The detective was now wearing an earpiece that hadn't been visible before. Occasionally, his lips would move slightly, as though he was speaking to someone, though no sound could be heard. The air marshals seemed to respond to unspoken cues, adjusting their positions in a synchronized dance that most passengers wouldn't notice unless they were looking for it. As the plane continued its journey westward, the truth about this flight began to dawn on the more observant passengers. This wasn't just about an unruly passenger or a random security check. The carefully orchestrated movements, the strategic positioning, the subtle communications, it all pointed to something much bigger. The woman in first class represented something significant, though exactly what remained a mystery to the other passengers. Her designer clothes and confident demeanor suggested success, but there was something else, a hardness in her eyes when she thought no one was watching, a calculation in her movements that spoke of someone used to being watched. Little did the other passengers know, but they were witnessing the culmination of months of international investigation work. The next hour would reveal exactly why this particular flight had become the perfect stage for what was about to happen, and why that nervous woman in first class was worth all this careful attention. As the flight continued its journey toward San Francisco, pieces of information began circulating through the cabin in hushed whispers. The woman in first class wasn't just any passenger. She was one of the most sought-after cybercriminals in the world. Her designer clothes and expensive accessories had been bought with money stolen through elaborate digital heists that had left banks and insurance companies scrambling. The detective's staged outburst earlier had been a carefully planned distraction, allowing the air marshals to position themselves without drawing attention. He had been tracking this case for months, following a trail of digital breadcrumbs across 3 continents. This flight wasn't randomly chosen. It was the first time their target had created a pattern, taking the same route 4 times in the past 2 months. A flight attendant paused near the business consultant's row, pretending to check the overhead bins while quietly explaining to nearby passengers why this arrest had to happen in the air. "She has a history of disappearing at airports," the attendant whispered. "This was our best chance." The passengers nodded, understanding dawning on their faces. The tech workers, listening intently, pieced together more of the story from their own knowledge of cybersecurity. One of them recognized the pattern. Several major tech companies in San Francisco had recently reported suspicious activities in their networks. The timing matched perfectly with the target's previous flights. The retired military officer shared a quiet observation with his wife and the passengers around him. He'd noticed how the woman never used the plane's Wi-Fi, yet somehow her phone had been active at specific intervals. Smart, he muttered, using her own connection to avoid detection. But not smart enough. Through the cabin windows, the landscape below had changed from the Rocky Mountains to the Nevada desert, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the sandy expanse. The young boy who had been so observant earlier was now drawing in his notebook pictures of what he imagined a real cyber detective would look like, complete with a computer-shaped badge. The business consultant noticed something else. The target's apparent composure was starting to crack. Her fingers would occasionally flutter toward her coat pocket, where a subtle bulge suggested a hidden hard drive or phone. Each time she seemed to consider reaching for it, one of the air marshals would shift position slightly, reminding her that she was being watched. More details emerged as passengers pieced together fragments of conversations. The woman had allegedly orchestrated attacks that drained pension funds and insurance accounts, but her real specialty was something more sophisticated. She didn't just steal money. She manipulated stock prices through fake news websites and social media campaigns, causing chaos in financial markets. The flight attendants moved through their duties with practiced ease, but their routine had hidden purposes. Every drink service, every pass through the cabin was a carefully timed part of the surveillance. They had been briefed about this operation weeks ago, trained to spot any suspicious movements or potential escape attempts. The plane hit another patch of turbulence, and the captain's voice came over the intercom again. To most passengers, it was a routine announcement, but the detective and air marshals recognized it as a coded message. They were exactly 1 hour from landing, and ground teams were in position at San Francisco International Airport. As the afternoon light filtered through the cabin, passengers found themselves part of something larger than they'd ever expected from a routine flight. The tech workers had stopped pretending to work, their laptops closed as they watched the subtle dance of law enforcement and flight crew. The retired couple held hands, their expressions showing both concern and fascination. The woman in first class checked her watch again, a gesture that had taken on new meaning now that everyone understood who she was. Her calm exterior remained, but there was a growing tension in her movements. She must have realized that her carefully constructed world of digital crime was about to crash down around her, not in some dramatic raid or high-speed chase, but here on a regular commercial flight over the western United States. The business consultant had been unusually quiet for the past 20 minutes, her face showing signs of growing recognition. Finally, she waved over a flight attendant, speaking in hushed tones that caught the detective's attention. Within moments, he was discreetly making his way to her row, pretending to stretch his legs. "I've seen her before," the consultant whispered, her eyes lighting up with realization. "On at least 3 other flights to San Francisco over the past 2 months. She always sat in first class, always carried that same handbag, and always seemed to be working on something on her phone during takeoff and landing, when we're supposed to have our devices off." The detective's expression remained neutral, but his eyes showed keen interest. This was exactly the kind of pattern confirmation they needed. The consultant wasn't done, though. She pulled out her tablet, showing her calendar app. "Look, I've marked my business trips. The dates match perfectly with the system breaches at my company. We lost significant data on each of these days." Meanwhile, one of the tech workers had quietly passed a note to an air marshal. As someone who worked in network security, he had noticed something odd about his phone's behavior on previous flights. There had been unusual interference with his corporate VPN, something that only happened on flights where this particular woman was present. The retired military officer's wife suddenly touched her husband's arm, remembering something important. During their last flight to visit their grandchildren, she had accidentally picked up the wrong laptop at the security checkpoint. "It looked just like mine," she explained to the air marshal. "But when I opened it, there were all these strange programs running." That woman. She was the one who quickly took it back, saying it was hers. The young boy who had been drawing in his notebook tugged at his mother's sleeve again. "Mom, remember when we couldn't buy my game last month? When the bank said our money was gone?" His mother's eyes widened as she made the connection. Their bank had been one of the institutions targeted in the cyber attacks. As these revelations spread through the cabin in whispered conversations, passengers began sharing more observations. A college student remembered seeing the woman's face on a warning poster at her part-time job at a credit union. A retired teacher recalled how his pension payment had been delayed due to technical issues that coincided with one of her previous flights. The flight attendant with silver streaked hair moved through the cabin, collecting these pieces of information like precious gems. Each passenger's story added another layer to the investigation, confirming patterns and revealing new connections. What had started as a carefully planned law enforcement operation was now being strengthened by the collective observations of ordinary travelers. Through the windows, the Nevada desert had given way to the Sierra Nevada mountains. The afternoon sun painted the snow-capped peaks in shades of gold and pink, a beautiful backdrop to the intense drama unfolding within the aircraft. The woman in first class remained still, but her reflection in the window showed signs of growing concern. She must have noticed the increasing number of whispered conversations, the way passengers would glance in her direction with newfound understanding. The tech workers had started quietly documenting everything they could remember about the network irregularities they'd experienced. The business consultant was writing down dates and details of her previous flights. Even the young boy contributed, carefully drawing what he remembered about the woman's laptop from when he had walked past her seat earlier. What made this situation extraordinary wasn't just the high-stakes cybercrime investigation. It was how a plane full of strangers had become an impromptu team of witnesses, each holding a small piece of a much larger puzzle. The detective and air marshals found themselves with more evidence than they'd expected, all thanks to the alert observations of regular passengers who had unknowingly crossed paths with their target multiple times. As the plane began its initial descent into San Francisco, the cabin hummed with a unique energy. Every passenger now felt part of something bigger than themselves, a complex investigation that had been hiding in plain sight during their routine travels. The woman in first class sat motionless, perhaps finally realizing that her carefully constructed criminal empire hadn't just been undone by law enforcement, but by the collective awareness of ordinary people who had been paying more attention than she'd thought. The descent into San Francisco International Airport began just as the golden afternoon sun tipped toward the Pacific Ocean. Through the windows, passengers could see the city's famous fog rolling in beneath them, creating a mystical blanket over the Bay Area. But inside Flight 2317, all eyes were focused on the drama reaching its final chapter. The captain's voice came over the intercom one last time, requesting that all passengers remain seated upon landing. To most travelers, it sounded like a routine announcement, but those in the know recognized it as the final signal. Everything was in place on the ground. The woman in first class maintained her composure, but her knuckles had turned white from gripping her handbag. The business consultant noticed how she kept glancing at the emergency exit, calculating distances and possibilities. The air marshals had positioned themselves strategically. Any move toward an exit would be futile. As the plane descended through the clouds, the retired military officer quietly explained to nearby passengers what they were about to witness. "Watch how smoothly they'll coordinate," he whispered, his experience allowing him to recognize the signs of a well-planned operation. His wife squeezed his hand, both of them feeling the weight of the moment. The tech workers had their phones ready, not to record, but to provide their contact information to the authorities. They understood that their observations about the network irregularities could be crucial evidence. The young boy had finished his detailed drawings, proudly showing his mother how he'd captured every detail of the suspect's laptop and unusual behavior. The landing gear deployed with a familiar thud, and the plane aligned with the runway. Through the windows, passengers could see several unmarked vehicles positioned near the gate, not obvious to the casual observer, but clearly law enforcement for those who knew what to look for. The touchdown was smooth, the pilot expertly guiding the aircraft to its designated gate. As the plane taxied, the flight attendant with silver-streaked hair made one final pass through the cabin, exchanging knowing glances with the law enforcement officers. Years of experience had taught her to stay calm in extraordinary situations, but even she had to admit, this flight was something special. The seatbelt sign remained on after they reached the gate. The woman in first class shifted slightly, but the air marshals were ready. The detective stood up first, his badge now clearly visible. "Please remain seated," he announced to the cabin, his voice carrying authority but also reassurance. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. Local FBI agents boarded the plane efficiently, their movements precise and practiced. The woman surrendered without resistance. She knew the game was up. As she was led off the plane, passengers noticed she'd left her precious handbag behind. The tech workers exchanged knowing looks. That bag likely contained enough evidence to unravel her entire operation. What happened next surprised everyone. The detective turned to address the cabin, thanking the passengers for their patience and cooperation. "What you've witnessed today," he explained, "is the result of months of international cooperation. But what made this operation truly successful was the awareness and attention of ordinary travelers like yourselves." One by one, passengers who had contributed information were asked to stay behind briefly to provide statements. The business consultant's travel records, the tech worker's observations, the retired couple's encounter with the switched laptop. Every piece helped complete the puzzle. As the remaining passengers finally deplaned, they found themselves sharing a unique bond. The young boy waved goodbye to the air marshals, who couldn't help but smile at his enthusiasm. The retired military officer shook hands with the detective, exchanging the knowing looks of professionals who understand the importance of timing and patience. Outside the plane, the San Francisco fog had begun to lift, revealing a spectacular sunset over the bay. News crews were already gathering at the terminal, having caught wind of the significant arrest. But the real story wasn't just about catching a cybercriminal. It was about how a routine flight became an extraordinary example of cooperation between law enforcement and alert citizens. In the days that followed, more details emerged. The woman's arrest led to the recovery of over $300 million in stolen funds, the prevention of future attacks on major financial institutions, and the dismantling of an international cybercrime network. But for the passengers of Flight 2317, the most remarkable part wasn't the size of the case. It was how their ordinary Monday morning flight had transformed into a moment they would never forget.